Well, welcome back to Civically Minded, where I give you practical theology for everyday life. As always, I'm your host, Corey Wing. Did you know that all of my interview segments are now being added to my audio podcast on Apple and Spotify? Simply search for Civically Minded and enjoy solid Christian content on your long commute while you're at work or the gym or wherever you prefer to listen to your podcasts. And be sure to tell a friend how they too can enjoy Civically Minded. And if you enjoy my content, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I have the privilege of having two PCA teaching elders as my guests today, and I got to be honest, I'm looking so forward to this conversation. These are two men that I'm getting to know better. Nate and I have spent a little time together the last couple of years at General Assembly, and Matthew and I are just getting to know each other. But these two men are faithful brothers, and I just, like I said, I can't say how forward I've been looking to this. So without further ado, let me introduce these two wonderful men. Nate Xander is the teaching elder at Christ the King PCA in, is it Louisville or Louisville?
It's Louisville.
Because that's a word you never know. So I always
ask. The locals will get grumpy.
I get it. It's like Lancaster or Lancaster. Yeah. So in Louisville, Tennessee, and he's been married to his wife, Leslie, since 2015. They have 4 kids. He currently serves on the editorial board of reformingmen.com and co-hosts the Reforming Men podcast. Matthew Adams is the senior pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Dillon, South Carolina. He's married to Beth and the father of 3 covenant children himself. Matt is a member of the General Council of the Gospel Reformation Network and the author of the forthcoming book, Act Like a Man, which is going to be released in the spring of 2026. He also serves as a member of the editorial board for reformingmen.com and is the co-host of 2 podcasts, Reforming Men and Larger for Life. I'm excited to have you both here today, guys. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Corey. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Oh, my pleasure. So, in full disclosure, I have written all of one article for your blog for Reforming Men. You guys were gracious enough to read it and go, okay, and let it and you let it pass. So I appreciate that. Being the lowly ruling elder that I currently am, and I say that only tongue in cheek. You guys have what you're doing over there, and especially with adding the video element. I thought that was something that you guys probably should have been doing because a lot of your articles have been so prescient for a lot of what's been going on, kind of life of the church, life of just Christian men in general. And so I love that you've now got the new element of adding that secondary piece. So walk the audience through kind of how this whole project came to be, and both the blog and then kind of how the blog morphed into now what you're doing with the podcast.
Yeah, so I was on the original group chat where we started thinking about what we can do to help disciple men, specifically in the PCA. We had seen a lot of young men start desiring for there to be people talking about our rich theology, but how that applies to practical Christian living as a man. One of the things that we have to note is godly, faithful living as a man is different than godly living faithfulness as a woman. God created us different. And so one of the problems that we saw within our own denomination is that there was a lot of movements trying to take this idea of women's discipleship or women's ministry and just plug it in for men. But that's not what men need. Men need some practical teaching. Men need deep discipleship. Men need deep relationships. And they started looking really everywhere for there to be some sort of answer for all of their burning questions, especially when we began to see a negative Christian society. We began to slide into this postmodern culture. We started seeing even the secular news shouting at toxic masculinity and what that means. According to Politico, it was J.D. Vance is the vice president who has a beard. That is toxic masculinity. And so we decided, instead of our are guys running to all of these different resources like Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson or Jocko Willink or Brandon
Nick
Tate.
Fuentes.
Yeah, Nick
being the
Fuentes.
newest one. Yeah.
We needed an outlet to start speaking specifically to PCA men. And so that's why the blog started. We said we were going to do blogs. We were going to try to get PCA teaching elders and ruling elders to write for us. And then Nate came along a little bit later in that process. And really, he and Ben started firing up the idea of a podcast. And then podcast went a little silent for a little bit. We took a little bit of a summer hiatus. And then Nate and I picked back up the mantle with the podcast and adding the video element and things like that. So really, it was just to speak into a void. The PCA was doing nothing as a denomination to reach men other than treating them like women. And that something had to change. And so we just took it and ran with it.
Nate, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I've really nothing to add to that. I had no idea. I'd never met Matt Adams. I'd never met Josh Reagan or Ben Ratliff. We had mutual friends. Like we're both friends with Derek Bright. I've known Derek since Derek and I were both licensed or pursuing licensure in the same presbytery. We were both interns in the Tennessee Valley Presbytery at the same time. I met Ben Ratliff through Ryan Beasy. He was hosting the Westminster Standard podcast, and he had me and Ben on. And I said some things on that podcast that resonated with Ben, and Ben said, "I think we found our fourth guy for reforming men." And so I didn't know I was interviewing for a job that wouldn't pay anything, but I was. and so yeah, it's funny. I met Ben at Presbytery, or not Presbytery, but General Assembly, like a few months after we started we all started the blog together, and the first words out of his mouth were, "You're a lot taller in person than I thought." And I said, "You're a lot shorter in person than I thought you'd be." So, Ben's just, Ben is a dreamer and a doer. And man, you get a guy who's both a dreamer and a doer, and you're going to get a guy. I mean, the guy has like 3 podcasts, or like at one point he did, he's not doing the Reforming Men podcast anymore. But really, all of this is his fault if it goes badly, and all of this, all credit to him if it goes well, because he really is the guy that kind of lit the fire under this project and all that it will become. So big shout out to him. And I'm hoping eventually we get to the point where we could do something like a Reforming Men conference. It won't start very big, but it's clear that I think we need a PCA NAPARC driven, men's voice speaking to men's discipleship. I think we've got great theology in NAPARC, but I think there's just a lot of young men that just need basic, practical, how to be a man 101 type stuff, and they need encouragement, and they need to be told that being a man is good. Stepping into the shoes that God has given for us to fill as young men. It's not toxic. It's not evil. And we shouldn't apologize for it. Like we shouldn't have to walk on eggshells just to be what God made us to be. So I'm hoping that we can serve that purpose in whatever capacity the Lord will allow us to serve it.
That's good. I share so much in common with a lot of what you both said, as far as obviously my tagline, as you both heard it on the intro read there, is practical theology for everyday life. And I am so passionate about that, that it's almost hard to express. I've met too many men, especially men, and women too, but men are supposed to be doers, to kind of piggyback off your point there about Ben. We were designed to be doers. We're not supposed to be just guys that sit around and think big thoughts. We're supposed to go out and do big things. And I know when I've talked to different counselors over the years, or even Christian psychologists, things like that, one of the things that I've heard across the board is that women are, again, more studiers, thinkers, and a lot of pastors and Christian Counselors have told me, you know, when I've got a woman that comes in and, you know, she says she's got an issue, whether it's with her marriage or just in her personal life, she wants to consume information ad nauseum, you know, because that's how she's wired. You can't give her enough things to read. You can't give her enough things to listen to, but she struggles with making a final decision. And all these guys tell me, and the men are almost the opposite. You know, they don't want a ton of homework, but they're ready to make a decision right now. You know, and so sometimes I have to, you know, tell them, no, you're not really ready to make a decision right now. And as I've went into full-time ministry, you know, at Sheer Church where I'm at, and worked alongside Dr. Stephen Stout, who I get to work alongside with, who's taught me a ton. One of the things I've noticed, because our church is no different than any of your churches, you know, where you've got some godly, saintly, wonderful women whose husbands claim to be Christians and never show up, you know, and even a few whose husbands aren't Christians. They were married, you know, back before either of them were saved. She's come to Christ and he's still not. And I tell them when I talk to them, you know, in a ministerial fashion, I'll say, you know why your husband won't come here? It's because he's a man. And if he's confronted with truth, he has to do something with it. That's how we're wired.
Yep.
He's got to do something with that information. He cannot just compartmentalize it. That's just not how we're wired. So I love that you guys have leaned into understanding this is what men are. To your point, we shouldn't have to sit and argue about it or you know, apologize for it. So what can we do to practically come alongside our brothers in Christ and say, you know, we're here for you. We want to see you succeed. We're on your side. We're cheering for you, but we're also cautioning you. You know, I mean, I've got a son and you guys have kids, you know, and I've got 2 daughters, you know, so the way that I think about my daughters and the way that I think about my son is very different.
Right.
Yep. You know, and one of the things I tell my son is beware your passions or your appetites, you know, and I don't tell my daughters that, you know, I'm not nearly as concerned about that with them as I am with my son. You know, men have a way of, boys included, you know, letting their appetites run away with them. And then it's just kind of Katie bar the door. So, you know, it is funny how we have to kind of contextualize what we're doing, particularly for men. So to that effect, tell me, kind of whichever one of you wants to take this, or again, you can kind of bounce it back and forth. What are some of the topics that you've seen, say in the last 12 months, even 18 months, that have really kind of bubbled to the surface that you're kind of seeing increasingly becoming issues that men, whether outside of the church or even within the church, are dealing with, that you guys are having to write and talk about?
Well, I'll go first because you hit on one, Corey. This idea of raising men. We've talked about this a number of times on the podcast, and it's something that I write about in length in my book that's upcoming. And when we're raising men, when we're raising boys to be men, they need a totally different home life than your daughters. And I know at first people push back at that and say, well, they're both kids, you know. Yes, they all need Christ. They all need to walk faithfully. But just as we're called to a different role of faithfulness and godly living as men, and women are called to a faithful life and godly life as women, we raise our boys different than the way we raise our daughters. I also have a boy and 2 daughters, and my son, who's our oldest, already at 8, he shows us that he needs things like responsibility. He shows us that he needs things like competition. He shows us these things, and how ignorant and foolish would it be for us not to give him those things in which he needs. Our daughters don't need those things like he does. Our daughters are much more complacent and content with, you know, playing teacher with baby dolls. Our son wants, you know, to tackle his friends playing football in the yard. He wants to go ride his bicycle around the neighborhood. He you know, he desires those things because the way he's wired by God, and therefore to help raise him with an understanding of not giving into his appetites, not giving into his fleshly struggles, even as a young boy, we're giving them responsibilities. You can go ride your bike, but you're going to be home at this time. You can go be competitive, but we're going to put you under good coaches who will show right discipline, who will teach you the right way. We're going to put you on teams where you'll learn how to, play as a team and work for a team, and you'll have responsibility in that team. And so that is, one of the things in which the culture has perverted the way in which we raise our children is, one, we let our children raise themselves by telling them, telling the parents what they are going to do in raising them or making decisions for them. But at the same time, if it's not the kids raise themselves, it's a cookie cutter approach. You need to be in tune with what they're feeling. You need to be seeing them and curious about their heart and all these things. And it goes all the way down to discipline. I discipline my son differently than I discipline my girls. And that's just practical, faithful fatherhood, in my opinion. And my my running theme when I'm disciplining my son is, I want you to be a more godly man than your dad is. I want something more for you. I want you to be a faithful husband, a faithful father, a faithful member of your society. And I tell my girls, I want you to be a faithful wife. I want you to be a faithful mother. And so I'm going to encourage, them playing with baby dolls. I'm going to encourage them in that nurturing desire that they are already displaying at 6 and 3. I'm gonna encourage that, but also at the same time, I'm going to encourage responsibility and cultivation and provision in my son, even at 8 years old. I'm going to absolutely do those things. So that's one of the things that we've written and talking about a lot on our blog and in our podcast.
There's formative
go ahead,
and corrective.
my apologies.
Yeah, there's formative and corrective discipline. And so I've got 3 boys, 7, 2.5, and of course the middle boy, 4.5. And we have to do formative discipline differently for our sons than we do for our daughter, because they're different. We're forming them into different things. One is going to become a man. The other, 3 are going to become men. One is going to become a woman. And the 7-year-old is already, he said to me yesterday, he said, "Hey, when are those black bags that we use every year to rake the leaves, when are those going to get here so that we can rake up the backyard?" And it's like, like Matt was saying, he wants he's taken that responsibility on for himself. He wants to do that. He wants to work. He values work. He wants to be outside doing stuff. If I could get him to have the same zeal for cleaning up his room, that would be great. But so there's all of these things, these positive proclivities that I see in my sons that I have to then make sure I shepherd in the right direction, so that when he's 17 and 27 and 37, he still sees the value of work, still has that sense of doing and accomplishing. And I don't want to stifle that. Whereas another son that I have is kind of lazy. He's content to let the other 2 brothers clean everything up. He's a dawdler. He makes excuses for why he can't. So I have to do formative and corrective discipline with him because if I don't, he will eventually become a 14-year-old who is a dawdler, who eventually will become a 24-year-old who is lazy and entitled and expects everybody else in the group project to do the work for him. And so work is a huge thing that we write on. Doctrine of vocation, the value of work. Derek Bright and Matt and I just got to talk a little bit about this. He talked. I think it's fair to call him a William Perkins scholar, and so William Perkins has written on the doctrine of vocation. It's definitely a doctrine that has been talked about a lot in the last 20 years, but not always from faithful sources or robustly confessional reformed sources. And so we need kind of that, we need that perspective kind of resurrected and revitalized in our PCA churches, because we want men in the PCA to see that, hey, it's not just teaching elders that have a calling from God. Like yes, our calling, our vocation is unique, but every man has not just a career, but a vocation. And there is I think a great example of this, my father-in-law, who passed away this past summer, he viewed his career in financial services. He did not view it as a job. He viewed it as a crusade. I mean, he genuinely, and I used to think it was a little weird. And then the more I learned about a good Reformed doctrine of vocation, I thought, man, this non-Reformed guy, I married his middle daughter, but I think he has a better understanding of vocation than maybe even I do, by accident somehow. Because he genuinely felt like God gave me this business. He gave me this calling. It's not just a job. And I want, my longing for the men in my church and for other men in my life is that they would be in a career where they feel like this is a calling or a crusade that God has given them.
That's helpful. And to both of your points, there is something so foundational. And this is one of the things that I think so many, not just young people, get wrong, but a lot of even middle-aged or older men get wrong, especially if they've not been discipled well, especially if they've not been under solid, preaching and teaching. And sadly, our churches have such men, and sometimes the fault of the church that we're at, sometimes they've come to our church more recently and they were coming from somewhere else. But I hear so often things about, how work and the fall are related in bad, unhealthy, unbiblical ways. And I'm always like, no, go back a chapter. that Adam is working prior to sin. Work is a very good, noble, healthy, biblical concept. But if we see it as a curse and not having been cursed, which is very different, one being a curse and one being affected by a curse, then it does really shift your entire motivation of why you get up and go do what you do. Even something as simplistic as, and I say simplistic, I don't know that Paul or the Corinthian church would have felt it simplistic, but in 1 Corinthians, chapter 10, verse 31, where it's, whether you eat or drink or whatever it is you do, do all to the glory of God. That is such a doctrine that could use recapturing,
Yeah.
And when I think about my son, and again, hearing you guys talk about your boys, my son is the one that wants, for dad to come over and choke slam him and then put him in the figure 4 leg lock. My girls, not so much. Once in a while they may go, that kind of looks fun, and then I do it and they're like, that was not near as fun as he made it look fun. He lied,
Yep.
and then they realize it's not, because they don't want to roughhouse with dad, But man, he does. He wants to roughhouse with dad every opportunity he gets. And I know what it's training for. It's training for the day that he can whoop me. And I know it's coming.
Yep.
I'm an old dad. I've got, my wife and I met later in life. We had kids later in life. I'm 47 years old, and so I know the day will come when my little guy is going to be stronger than me. It's coming. I hope it's a ways off yet, but and I relish that. I try to tell myself all the time, what else would I want than that, right? I mean, I don't want a boy that's weaker than me. I want my kids, and Matt, you said something very similar to this, and this is true of both my girls and my son. I want my kids to have the most boring testimonies in the history of Christendom.
Amen.
I don't want them to have the dark night of the soul that I had to go through, that my wife went through. I want them to just be covenant kids that were raised in a Christian home and in a godly church, and that's kind of it. They followed God all of their lives, and one day they died and went to see their Savior. To that point, with my son in particular, my son's name is Micah, and we named him Micah because to me, Micah 6:8 is maybe the single greatest verse in all of Scripture for men. as far as, and I tell my son, it's something we pray over him every night. We pray that verse over him every night. And then I've kind of added in a little bit of a litany of things that I say, to kind of bolster it, son, I pray that you would do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. I want you to be, I want you to look after the fatherless, the widow, and the weak. Things that inherently make up a good man, a Christian man, and I remember the first time he said, Papa, what does my verse mean? What does that mean? And so you guys are both teaching elders. Please correct my faulty hermeneutics or my bad exegesis here, if I go astray. But whenever I've looked at Micah 6:8, I see what is said, and then I try to see what's not said. So if the Lord instructs men to do justly, that means we are to be patternistic after him. He is a God of justice, so we must be just as well. Love mercy. Okay, we're to love it. But what's not being said? Well, what's not being said is sometimes mercy reaches its limitations. So that's how I've interpreted it to my son is, son, I want you to always default to mercy. And when mercy has run its course and it cannot be given any longer, then see directive number 1, which is do justly. So and then the third one is influencing the other two. So right. You walk humbly with God, and that's the overarching one. You love mercy. You be as compassionate and merciful in your dealings with people as you possibly can be. And when mercy has reached its absolute limitations, you do justly.
Yeah, Corey, I've got a Micah as well, my second born son. Love him dearly, and the Hebrew word there that is often translated as mercy is chesed. It's like a covenantal kindness. It's like an extraordinary kindness that is pretty much impossible for us to understand apart from receiving it from God. I think that word is used in the relationship between King David and Prince Jonathan as well. But I think one of the things we've been getting into, because we talk a lot on our blog about piety and different piety in the home, piety in the church, piety as husbands. And one of the things that we're starting to broach is, you can see this back on our October 8th article. We had Rob Pazienza, who's just a stud, write an article called Stand at the Gates, a call to Christian manhood. And we're kind of touching on piety in the political sphere. And we had James Baird on the podcast, who just wrote a book. I don't have my copy with me. I've got some spare copies right over my shoulder. King of Kings. It's basically a primer on magisterial two kingdom, not radical two kingdom, but just historic Westminsterian. The good stuff that came from our fathers who were much smarter than us 500 years ago. And because the reality is, I don't think when we started the blog or even the podcast that we thought we were going to have to weigh into political. I wasn't thinking about that at all. I'm very fired up about political theology, but I think it kind of got to the point where you see everything that's happening. I mean, your state, there's like 130 acres that just got purchased. They're about to build a Hindu temple on it with a statue to their god of war, their demon of war. And we've got teaching elders in the PCA who are like, oh, this is an opportunity for the gospel. And it's like, I don't think that any time in the Bible where the disciples of Yahweh saw a demon temple being erected or in their backyard that they were like, what an opportunity. It was something to be opposed.
No, it was an opportunity. All right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, I want to be careful here, but I also want to be very clear. Like, if we're going to be like, we're a confessional denomination. And that's what I love about James Baird, is he does such a good job of showing us in our standards. No, it's required of us as Christian confessional men, especially as elders and ruling elders, teaching elders and ruling elders. It's required of us to oppose this stuff. It's required of the civil magistrate to countenance Christianity and not false religions. And so anyway, there's all these different things happening in our society and in our own backyards, and it's part of masculine piety to represent your family and your people in the city gates. it's not a woman's job. I'll just say it. It's not a woman's job to represent her family or her tribe or her clan or her whatever in the city gates. When you read the Proverbs 31 woman, she's doing a whole bunch of stuff, but you know who's at the city gates? Her husband. That's where he's praising her. Yep. So if men want to, I mean, we forget passages like Isaiah. He says, hey, if your children are oppressing you in the streets and women are ruling you, like, you're under judgment.
Isaiah 3, if you want to look it up.
Yeah, Isaiah 3. Yeah.
That's right.
You know, and you know, like if John Knox were alive today, what would people think of? Anyway, that's a different rabbit trail. What would people think of his art? You know, his essay, the first trumpet blast. But you know, I just, if we want to help disciple men in a fully orbed confessional piety, we have to touch on political theology.
Yeah,
you know, I love sports and I love politics and I love religion. But there are times where I'm just kind of like, hey, I just want to go talk about something else. But that's just, we can't get away from teaching men how to think faithfully, how to be careful with the potential idol of sports, and how to how they need to understand that political theology is not really optional if you want to be a faithful Christian man in today's world or any society. Yeah. So we've started to broach that subject.
And I think it goes right back to what Corey was saying in that Micah 6:8 verse. You know, mercy and justice never contradict one another.
That's right.
You know, if we think about Micah 6:8 as, you know, walking humbly with your God, our God is perfectly just and our God is perfectly merciful. The very definition of both of those terms. He does not lessen one characteristic to elevate the other. And so when we are considering mercy and justice, that influences the way that we conduct ourselves in the civic sphere as well. You know, that we're merciful to the skeptic. We're merciful to the confused. We're merciful to the wayward. But we are to be just against gross sins like idolatry, these perverse ideologies of our day. I mean, so I mean, how can you be neutral when, you know, Virginia just elected an official who is overseeing crime, right? The chief prosecutor of the state, and he was dreaming openly in a conversation about murdering children. How can you be neutral? How can you be neutral when the mayor of one of our most prominent cities is talking about the glories of Islam and honoring Allah, and even his, you know, campaign staff are calling his victory in an election a victory for jihad? I mean, the perverse ideologies and the wicked political realm in which we live now, you know, we could have said, you know, third wayism works in a neutral Christian world or a positive Christian world. But what we saw about third wayism is it led to compromise. And now it's led to people just being complacent and neutral when we cannot afford to be so. It goes back to the doctrine of vocation. And what you were talking about, Corey, I went on a small little rant about this when we were talking with Derek Bright on our podcast. But we have, as a church, overemphasized this idea of alien and sojourner as the chief characteristic of the Christian life. Yes, we are not in a world that is our eternal home. We know that a new heaven and a new earth is coming. And God will, you know, consummate his kingdom forever. But we were never called to just stand up in the, you know, stand and gaze up in the skies and wait for his return. Remember, that's what the disciples were rebuked by the angel for after the ascension of Jesus. What are you doing? Didn't he give you a commission? Don't you have work to do? And so when we think about this idea of work, we think about it in the in the command, the creational command to cultivate God's creation for Adam. I mean, he was to tend the garden, to work the garden. He was to fill the earth, meaning he was to inhabit the world in such a way that he was cultivating what God has created. He was to make it better. That salt and light that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount was very much an application of the Christian godly life of Adam in Genesis 1 and 2. And we don't need to forget that. Either what I see in our denomination, in the evangelical church at large, is a bunch of men just staring up in the skies and going, well, this world's not our home. The kingdom of Christ is not of this world, so I'm just going to stand here and wait, and I'm going to long. But I mean, you brought up the Corinthian letters. Paul talks about the resurrection and the future of glory. He talks about our eternal place in the heavenly realm, but he also goes through great angst to explain how that changes the way we live right now. And so, not only can we not afford to be neutral or complacent in this terrible, wicked society in which we inhabit, but there is a duty to cultivate it, and to make it better, to preserve it. And I think that Micah 6:8 tells us, in the summary form, exactly what that looks like.
Yeah,
we're to love justice. Love mercy.
In our current era, we've divorced grace and nature, and we've also divorced the cultural mandate from the Great Commission. The cultural mandate is about nature. The Great Commission is about grace. We are sojourners and pilgrims, as James Baird pointed out on the episode we did with him. We are sojourners and pilgrims according to grace, but not by nature. I am an American. I was born here. My sons and my daughter, they're third generation Tennesseans. So, or I guess more like fifth generation Tennesseans. So it's like we are from here. This home, this is my home according to nature. And I think we've kind of hyper spiritualized so many different things. We forgot. Some people, I've heard people say this before. My mind is boggled by it. They would say that the Great Commission is the cultural mandate, and I'm going, no, these are two different things that go together, but they're not the exact same. And I think we also see the ethic of Micah 6:8 being completely misapplied, even by teaching elders and ruling elders in our denomination, in their political theology. And you see it from people all the time. It just goes back to empathy, goes to toxic empathy. The empathy for the people that are the actual aliens according to nature in our land, the sojourners. They get mercy, 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 mercy at the expense of doing justice for people who actually live here. Right. And like you said earlier, Corey, these things are not enemies. These things do not contradict one another. They go hand in hand. And, we are just so given over to our empathy for, it's so sad that these people are being arrested and being sent back to the country that they're from. How sad is that? It's like, well, wait a minute. I want to love these people, but we also have a responsibility to love and do justice for the citizens that were negatively impacted by these non-citizens breaking the law.
That's right.
And then people will come up with this, like, well, Jesus was an illegal alien. No, Jesus fled as a baby from one part of the Roman Empire to another. It's not the same. It's not the same. It's like going from the state of Tennessee down to Mississippi, and if it just, and eventually he came back. Eventually his family came back to Israel. So even there, it was more like a temporary refugee thing. But again, one part of the Roman Empire to another. It's not the same. It's not the same.
So much so that he is identified by who he is and where he's from. Isn't this the Nazarene?
That's right.
I mean, They know who he is and they know where he's from. I mean, he proudly kind of wears it. So no, it's that you are missing so much or misrepresenting, which is usually what's happening. It's rarely a missing. Sometimes people miss it, but the men that we know that are other guys that do what we do, usually it's misrepresenting. You know, I mean, they're better, they're more learned than this, so they're being slippery.
No, but Corey, I think in some cases that's true, but I genuinely believe some of these guys, they're just so ill-formed. They're not from a Reformed background. They're from an evangelical background. The PCA right now is standing on the fault lines of a new schism, a schism between historic Protestantism and modern evangelicalism. Kind of like 1054, there's these 7 different things that lead to the split of the Eastern Church and the Western Church, and that's how we get Orthodoxy versus Roman Catholicism. I think that's where we are today, 1,000 years later. And the PCA is, the big tent is right in the, we're right on top, dead center, of that fault line. And a lot of these guys, they're coming in from the evangelical world through Calvinistic soteriology. And they're like, I'm Reformed because I believe in tulip and the 5 solas. And it's like, no, that's not quite. And so they've been shaped and molded by, or misshaped and mismolded in their thinking and their education and their ecclesiology and their and everything else by the evangelical world. And then all of a sudden they're swimming in confessional waters and we're going, something's off here. So I think some guys, they do know better. There are guys who have been in the PCA for 40 years. They were trained at RTS Jackson, they know better. Right. And then there's these other guys that, they got to seminary, they had no idea what the PCA was. And then all of a sudden, 5 years later, they find themselves in the PCA. So I do want to be careful there because I don't want to lump everybody out in the same boat. But yeah, we just, and we have presbyteries that are so different. We have presbyteries that we have literally I won't say which ones, we have neighboring presbyteries in the PCA where this presbytery over here says, if you have exceptions, or you have stated differences, you can't practice them, right? We'll let you in, but you can't practice them. And then the neighboring presbytery says, if you don't have stated differences, we don't think you've actually read and understood the confession of faith, and we're going to heavily scrutinize you. So we, you can get into one presbytery, no problem, and then you're trying to transfer into another, and all the guys that are kind of from there, so to speak, are going, where was this guy trained? Right. I mean, and it goes both ways. Right. So we're in a big tent denomination. It might be a little bit too big. And we're experiencing tensions over that, which is, again, going back to the political theology. It's again, how we get men who are like someone basically just said to me the other day, as I said, hey, you seem to be having a stated difference here with the Westminster Standards. Have you registered that with your presbytery? And the answer I got back from that was astounding. The answer to that question was, hey, our presbytery doesn't really think that this difference is a big enough deal to even really deal with it that way. And it's like, that's not how that works. You know what I mean? And the excuse was, well, everybody has a stated difference. Well, then everybody has to state it. That's what good faith subscription is. It's good faith subscription is not, well, everybody holds this stated difference, so no one has to do anything about it. Good faith is, well, then everybody needs to state it, right? So anyway, it's just wild, and it's just part of the big tent life we've got in the PCA.
Now I'm going to go off script. Do you guys think that because I couldn't agree more. Do either of you or both of you think that what you've just described, Nate, is how we have gotten ourselves into the kerfuffle that we are currently in with all of the Save the PCA stuff? You've got, I had George Sayer on, and we talked through that whole issue, and George, who certainly is very conservative, incredibly conservative guy, does not want to see female officers, whether real or functional, and that's, I think that terminology is so helpful, whether it's we're really doing it or we're just functionally doing it, and kind of, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. George doesn't want either of those things. And I mean, he was on, I know how he feels. I think I can speak for him on that. But his point in our episode was, I don't know what we're going to do about it. He said, because to your point, there are presbyteries that won't do anything about it. The SJC usually defaults to the lower court. So if they default to the lower court and the lower court's not going to do anything about it, I mean, and let's be honest, we just saw this happen with some of the stuff that went down in DC.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, and I mean, as soon as it was found out and made public, it was swept under the rug, basically.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
so
yeah.
Yeah,
No,
think. Go ahead. I'll let you go first, Matt.
Yeah, I you know, it's one of those things where, you know, what happened in DC would have been handled a lot differently in somewhere like PD Presbytery. You know, you know, PD Presbytery, you know, we have a spectrum, of course, but it's more kind of evangelical to confessional. Most of the younger guys in our presbytery are kind of the more confessionally robust guys. Some of the older guys or some of the more evangelical guys, they are self-admitting that. And so I don't have any problem saying that. But, you know, it's one of those things where when it came to, you know, celebrating a man apostatizing into Roman Catholicism, that's something that we can all agree on. You know, and yet, you know, when we get into things like functional women officers, it won't stay functional forever. I mean, it's just preparing the way for us to have long conversations about really truly having women officers. You know, you know, this is insider baseball. I understand for the PCA world, but one of the reasons that these churches won't use what our Book of Church Order allows, this assistant to the diaconate, is because they want to communicate some sort of authority within the church. They want their congregation to see these ladies as not assistants to the diaconate, or they would use that language. They want to elevate them to a functional position where the congregation looks at them as leaders within the local congregation. And so they're using titles that have been biblically prescribed for men. Shepherd, they just add a feminine, you know, suffix. Deacon, they just add a feminine suffix. And so they want their congregations to perceive the authority that these ladies have been given functionally. And the problem with, I think one of the biggest problems with the SJC is they are looking more at the procedures and the letter of the law rather than looking at the theological implications of what is being done. I mean, we saw that with Revoice years ago, where SJC ruled on, you know, whether or not the presbytery acted, you know, but they did not rule on the theological implications of our denomination by a man identifying as same-sex attracted. And until we get to a judicial commission that are looking more at substance rather than procedure, we are going to have an SJC deferring to lower courts and their decisions, which ultimately does not help promote the health and the purity, and I would argue even the peace of the PCA. So, I mean, that's insider baseball there, but I think there's a lot of parallels that we can draw between just political theology or men in the home or anything like that, because, you know, what we are doing with our blog, with our podcast, is we're taking theology and applying it, where our denomination is taking a very normative principle look at our procedures and what our Book of Church Order says or what our Book of Church Order doesn't outrightly forbid. And we're saying we're changing our theology with our application. It gets it totally backwards. Theology drives application. The Word of God prescribes the application. We can't change our theology. We cannot change our constitution based on your application in the local church. And I think that matters tremendously in the big tent in which we inhabit here in our denomination.
Yeah. The churches that are kind of doing this with functional female officers and the different titles, and they're it's not a monolith. There's different reasons and rationales for it. But one of the ones that I've heard is, well, in our context, the women in our church they won't feel honored, by this, by having by not receiving the title. These are, and I just, my running theory is I think a lot of elders in the PCA are afraid of the women in their churches. And it's like, just my exhortation would be, brothers, dare to disappoint women in the church. Like these women need to be pulled aside and encouraged. Hey, you can serve in the church and be valued and honored and appreciated and use your gifting here without a title, without a title that is, by the way, outside of the bounds, I believe, of our BCO. Not that they would really care about what the BCO says or know what it says, not because they're in rebellion, but because what average BCA congregant's like, yeah, I have my copy of the BCO in my house, So that's what I'm saying, is that the average person's just like not thinking about the BCO, right? So it's just an opportunity for discipleship. And it's harder. Yeah, you got yours. It's harder to disciple. It's harder to pull somebody aside and disciple them and help them see that they're valuing the wrong thing. It's harder to pull them aside and say, hey, let me explain that we're part of this denomination and we have to uphold the peace and purity, and clarity is kindness, clarity is charity. And so we want to be clear with people we have disagreements with. And this would muddy the waters. That's harder than just saying, well, you know what, we're going to give you the title. Right. So anyway, I think we have to dare to disappoint people and disciple them instead.
I think, again, I think that's helpful, because ministry is always harder and less sexy than, and I mean the real ministry of the boots on the ground. I shared with you guys right before we went live that we had a member pass away last night, and I'd been in the hospital 4 or 5 different days, with him and his family. There's nothing sexy about that. That's not this. The podcast, yeah. the conference speaking, the Sunday morning sermon, those are all the fun parts of the job. Let's be honest. Yeah, that's all the stuff that most of us love. The true ministry of doing church discipline, or visiting people and visiting the sick and the broken, discipling people through stuff that they are errant on, that's important stuff, but it ain't fun stuff, and it isn't sexy stuff. So I to your point, I couldn't agree more. I think we get so very caught up in the parts of the job that we love, and let's call it, I'll just be as transparently honest as I can be. We are not perfect either. No pastors are.
That's right.
So we're not immune to ego stroking, and we're not immune to those things. So the things that get us the likes, whether that's
Sure.
in person or online, that when you hear, golly, pastor, that was a great sermon today. Yeah. Who doesn't? I'd prefer that to, that was terrible. It's, I'm not an idiot, but but the real ministry of sitting a woman in your church down and saying, you need to understand that your only value to this church is not by you becoming a man.
Yeah. Right.
That right. God is not so cruel as to tell his female followers that the best way for them to serve him is by becoming something they're not.
Yeah.
That defrauds them. It defrauds God. It defrauds the current leadership structure of our denomination, and pretends, because this is one of the arguments that I've heard. I'm getting curious if you guys have heard this one too, of, well, some of our male leadership just doesn't really know the needs and how to minister properly to women. Then there's a problem. Aren't these men married? Do any of them have daughters? Even if the answer to both of those is no, then I don't need to practice every gross sin enumerated in scripture to be able to preach against it or to minister to someone who has dealt with, severe drug abuse. If I have to do standpoint epistemology on every single issue that's going to come up in ministry, then I'm going to quit now, because not only can I not do it, I don't want to do that.
Yeah. The ancient Greeks believed that that women were failed men. They were beings that were going to be men, and something went wrong, and it's a failure, right? And sometimes it seems like people are operating from that perspective. It's that these women are striving to become more like men. They don't realize that. They don't realize that's what they're doing. But it's like, no, you don't need to do, like, the whole Kathy Keller line that everybody's championed. Well, women in our church can do everything that an ordained man can do. And it's like, to me, that's just born out of that worldview. It's like, no, the women don't become the maximized, most flourishing version of themselves by becoming more like their brothers and their fathers and their husbands and their sons. So we've got women in our church that are just doing, they're doing Titus 2 work. They're just doing wonderful kind of organic discipleship of younger women in the church without a title, without needing to be called deaconess or shepherdess or women's director or whatever. They're just being the body. Part of our job as elders is to equip the body for the ministry of the church. And when someone is well equipped for the ministry of the church, we don't have to give them a title. Like,
right. You're a church member. You have a title. Yep.
Yeah. You are a Christian. There's your title, right? So, it's quite a mess.
Yeah. One of the parallels that I've made trying to explain, the prescription of the scriptures to the life of men and women, especially in the realm and the sphere of the local churches. I mean, we've preached sermons. We're confessional Presbyterians. When you begin to articulate our Sabbath view, what is the immediate response of those who you're talking to, whether it be a congregation or counseling or discipleship? People begin to ask, well, what can't I do on Sunday, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can I do this? Can I do that? Can I do this? And I always, when I start hearing those questions, I always try to flip it, and I go, let's not talk about the fourth commandment in a limiting view. Let's view it as, what do I get to do? What's going to give me the most joy? What is going to give God the most glory? And that's worshiping the Lord. That is fellowship with the believers. That's acts of mercy. We have a prescription of what we get to do. And it's life-giving. The same thing is true when you begin to articulate men and women's roles in the life of the church. People go, well, what can't women do? No. Let's reverse it. What do women get to do in the life of the church? Because that is the way of joy and God's glory to be elevated within the congregation. And so I've written on my Substack an article a few weeks ago. I think I titled it something like "The Word Nobody Wants to Hear," and it's essentially an argument for, the word no. The most gracious thing we can tell our people sometimes is no, because behind that is God's most blessed yes. And I think that's what it's going to take in the PCA for guys just to man up and go, no, women cannot inhabit these offices. These offices have been prescribed by God for men. However, there is a much more grand yes behind that. Here's what you get to do as women. And this is where you will feel, the value and the honor of the congregation when you begin to operate as a woman in the life of the church. And so, we saw the firestorm right after the blog post went out about sidelining women in the PCA. there were so many women who said, I've been practicing hospitality. I've been laboring to free my husband up to be a good elder. I've been laboring to help my husband devote himself to a preaching and teaching ministry. I've been working with our children. I've been, they've listed all these things, and they are greatly offended because a group of people have told them, by being a woman in the local church, you have been sidelined. And actually, they just sidelined the majority of the women in the PCA by their comments. And that's just, that's just the danger, that fault line that Nate was talking about, that we find ourselves hovering over. Are we willing to say no, so that God can say yes? God, are we going to allow God's prescription of men and women in the church, but also in the home or in society, in the marriage? Are we going to say that we know better than God? Because this is how God has prescribed marriages to work, and homes to work, and society to work, and churches to work. And I mean, it would be utter foolishness to not think that God has given an organization to those institutions. That is male led, by the way.
Yeah. Nate, you have anything to add to that?
No, as Matt was talking, it's not really adding to that. It was just a thought that popped up. I was reminded about how we had an article. I was looking it up here. We had an article that was posted earlier this year. It was biblical. It was drawing from scripture. It was talking about, it was a good exhortation and caution to men to basically listen to their wives and hear what their wives are saying, but to not make the mistake of Adam, which is to basically submit to your wife through listening to what she says and being easily manipulated by bad things that your wife is saying. And I thought it was a very careful article, and there was things that were kind of nuanced out in brevity, but it was fine. And we got an email from a woman, who wanted us to take the article down because then she cited the article and said, this line from this author is dangerous, and here's why. And then I reread the article, and all of her objections were answered in the article. She just wasn't reading carefully. She had an emotional response to something that was said, and she didn't do the author justice and just keep reading the next 3 paragraphs in which he totally clears up any sort of objections that she might have. And this is the world we're living in, where someone has a feeling about something that's said, and it totally eliminates the necessity to keep reading in context and to keep reading for clarification. And this is, I've experienced this as a pastor. A wife comes to me concerned and says, "You said this in your sermon." And my response is, "I did not say that in my sermon. I preach from a full manuscript. Here's my notes. Let me take you to the paragraph." And the husband's like, "We've already talked about this. I've told her that's not what you meant. Here's what you meant." I'm like, "Listen to your husband. He's exactly right. He picked up exactly what I was saying in the sermon. This has happened half a dozen times, and we're just wired differently. We have to, and these women are very, very gracious. And, once I clarify for them again, and they have the word of their loving husband and a pastor who cares about them, they're like, "Okay, I misunderstood. Thank you for clarifying that." And it's, we move on. But what happens in churches and in situations where they don't have loving husbands like that, that they don't trust, that they don't have a good relationship with, that they're not having these conversations with? And I think that's probably happening. Not, I don't want to call it the PCA, but just think in American churches in general, there's probably a lot of things being taken in without that marital sounding board being allowed to, work in the way God has intended, to restrain both men and women. Right? There's times where men come up with an idea about something to do, and the wife plays the role of going, okay, hold on a second.
Yep.
Have you really, have you really thought this really, this, you got this great idea, but have you thought about X, Y, and Z? Right. So we've been given, I love what the confession says about marriage. We've been given to each other for our mutual help. And one of our roles as husbands is to be a mutual help for our wives, and to help them not spiral. To sometimes they can latch onto something and they begin to ruminate on it, and we're to kind of pull them back and go, don't go down the vortex. That's a black hole. The black hole of doom. Don't go down it. And then there's other times where we come up with some idea, and our wives have to be kind of that civilizing force upon us that says, okay, hold on. Let's think through this. Let's think this through. Let's talk about it. Right. And so it's a beautiful and wonderful mutual help. And I would just encourage men listening to this, I am not saying that you need to proofread and pre-read every book and blog and podcast before your wife listens to it. But you need to know, both for your wife and for your children, what kind of content is coming into your home.
Yep.
And you need to be responsible for it. You need to help them think through. You need to be, turn off the TV and talk, talk to the kids, talk to your wife about like what they're reading, what they're absorbing, and how their worldview is being shaped. I think you'll find a lot of fruitfulness in that. And you'll also, I think, really help shepherd the people in your home well by doing so.
I did a short, we're talking 3 minutes. YouTube shorts can only be 3 minutes or less. So I did a short on K-pop demon hunters a couple months back for that very reason. I've got a 10-year-old daughter, and everyone in her world has seen K-pop demon hunters.
She's the target audience.
And so I sat down one day and I watched it, and I engaged with it. And then I let my wife watch it. And then we said, maybe we sit down and watch it with her, and then we talk through it with her, and we expose the Asian demonology that's rampant in it. But we also expose some of the decent stuff that's in it. That, that there is some nobility in some of the themes, and because I'm increasingly convinced as my children get older that we are living in such a day and an age with the internet, and my kids go to a very strict Christian school, and they're in church all the time. I have extremely Christian kids coming up in an extremely Christian subculture, yet they are still going around going 6, 7, and I'm like, what the crap is 6, 7?
I know, man. I know. Even my 3-year-old's doing it. It's so annoying.
But I bring that up to say our kids are getting it. No matter how much we safeguard them, they are still getting exposed. So we must be all the more diligent to not be completely ignorant of what's happening around us, and say, hey, I'm going to help my, to your point, your wife as well, your wife, your children, engage with some of this material and understand it from a Christian perspective. And that's true for the young men in our churches. It's true for us. I am grateful for men like you guys. I'm grateful for the other TEs and REs in my world, the podcast friends I've made in this content creation, guys in the PCA, but also the guys like Keith Foskey, who aren't in the PCA at all, but have just become solid brothers in Christ, who I can run to and say, man, am I thinking clearly about this? Because it is imperative that we don't isolate ourselves and become some kind of bizarre island that is operating, unto our own. So as we wrap this up, and guys, I want to say how thankful I am for the amount of time you've been willing to give me today, and just the way that you've processed a lot of what we've talked about is testament to how much you've been engaging with all of these topics. And so to my audience, if you've not been familiar with Reforming Men, go check out Reforming Men. The work they're doing, certainly on the blog, but also in the podcast, and now the videos on YouTube are just incredible. You will be enriched by what these men are doing. Turn your sons and your husbands onto it if you're a female that watches my channel. If you are a female that watches their stuff, don't pester them like this other young lady. I mean, just be kind. Let them minister to men. Is there any, since I run a channel that's all about practical theology, and you guys are running a ministry that's, similarly about practical theology, is there any short tips that you could give anyone watching, men or women, that might be watching this episode, of things that they could go out today and do that are practical action items that would help them grow in their faith immediately?
Nate, you go first.
Family worship.
Oh,
sit down with your wife and your kids, read the Bible. I actually have a great little book. If you do it every day, you can basically read and pray through the whole Bible in a year. And so I usually do lead family worship through that. It gets the Psalms in the diet for the kids. It gets it starts with a call to worship and it ends with a word of blessing from various verses. And so do family worship. You'll be enriched and blessed by it. And I've never walked away from family worship and said, I regret doing that. Even when it's hard, even when it's basically 20 minutes of me disciplining kids and 10 minutes of reading the Bible. I've never regretted it. So that would be my exhortation.
And my exhortation would be, our desire is to see godly, Christ-like men, right? And so no matter how much men want a quick fix, no matter how much men want to kind of do it on their own, you're not going to be able to. Entrust your life to the Spirit. Pray that God will enable you to be a faithful man, and believe in the sufficiency of the Word. The Word has much to say about being faithful men, faithful husbands, faithful fathers, faithful churchmen, faithful members of society. It's all that we need for life, faith, and obedience. And so that sounds, ordinary means of grace, right? Pray more and trust yourself to the Spirit and let the Spirit work through the ministry of the Word. It will be a benefit.
Yeah. Amen on both those points. I want to thank you guys again. Thank you for being my guest today. Thank you all that watch this podcast and give me a reason to do this. I've loved it. I'm coming up on my 2-year anniversary next week of Civically Minded, and it has been some of the most fun I've ever had in my entire life. So thank you to each of you that have made this a reality for me and let my family kind of see their dad and their husband do something that he didn't think he was possible, like even capable of doing 2 years ago. So I'm grateful to my audience. And remember, always be brave, be bold, and be civically minded. God bless.